Welcome to the 300 After Hours. This is when we just spend a little additional time talking about what we talked about, our weekly young adult Bible study. And tonight I have Evan here with me. Thank you for being here, Evan, and joining me tonight. Tonight we're still in chapter 1, and we covered verses 11 and 12. So, Evan, let me just go ahead and read these verses, and then I'll just ask you for your thoughts or anything you guys talked about at the table there. Paul says, I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel, for I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. All right, there you go. Did anything stand out to you guys, or what did you guys talk about at the table there?
Yeah, we talked about, especially amidst your teaching on the last part of verse 11, where it says, is not man's gospel. Mm-hmm. The gospel that Paul is teaching isn't man's gospel, and the specific implication of is versus was.
Mm-hmm. So that says, so you're talking about, Paul says, I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me, we were talking about the difference of if he had said that the gospel that was preached by me was not man's gospel. That would be true, that it was not man's gospel when he preached it, but it wouldn't necessarily mean that it is true today, right? And so you're saying that is brings that into it, not just it was preached, but it is something today, that it still is the same gospel, right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, what it is not man's gospel, right? So, yeah, that was a good point. I liked when we were talking about that. Anything else stand out to you in that?
I think it just kind of testifies to the eternality of the gospel, and what it actually does, and especially with it being not man's gospel, it being Christ. And we talked also of the inseparability of Christ and the gospel, and to distort one is to distort the other.
Yeah, that would be there when we talked about the fact that Paul says, I received the gospel, through a revelation of Jesus Christ. And the difference between that, a revelation of Jesus Christ, or if Paul had said, which some Bibles actually say this, but most of them don't, and I think this is more accurate, but the difference between being a revelation of Jesus Christ or a revelation from Jesus Christ. And certainly if it was from Christ, it would still be true, but you could also say, well, then might he not give that a different revelation to someone else and a different gospel for this continent? If it's from Christ, we're talking about the manner in which it was delivered. If it's of Christ, we're talking about the content of the message, right? That it is about Jesus Christ. And therefore, like what you're saying, you can't change it. We can't change it any more than we could change Jesus Christ. And so I think that's a real important, valid thing. And I know that you had even talked about how that causes you to have a certain reverence, too, for the gospel, right? Because I would imagine that you have a lot of people out there that are saying, you have a lot of diversity in terms of, like, what is gospel truth, right? You guys are faced with a lot of different gospels out there.
Yeah, a lot of false gospels.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people that have just used things for power and money and fame, and that's just really what's trending right now is popularity.
Yeah.
And so people will do anything for that, and even going so far as to distort the living God.
Yeah. So if the gospel is inseparable from Jesus Christ, right? I mentioned Jesus saying to those religious leaders in the New Testament, he says, you study the scriptures because by them you think you're made holy, and these are they which testify of me. That all the scriptures, the Old Testament is pointing to Christ. Jesus shows up in his incarnation. He's the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. And so it all points to him, and then the New Testament letters are about how Jesus is the fulfillment of all that. So the gospel is about Christ. And we can't change the gospel any more than we could change Christ, and that would then cause us to kind of have a reverence when we start saying that this is the gospel, or even our willingness to tolerate maybe other distortions to the gospel, that we would be less tolerant towards that if it actually is about Christ, not just from him, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Hey, I talked about two things in here. When Paul talks about two ways that he didn't receive, like the gospel, I just want to touch on this really quickly. What were the two ways that he didn't receive? He says, I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. What's the difference between receiving it and taught it? What was he talking about there?
Yeah. So like, receiving from man being like traditions passed down, things you just pick up on like colloquially, and just things you can observe people doing. Children, when they're being raised, will see their parents doing something and then ingrain that into their habits. It's just something they're picking up.
Yeah.
And that's receiving it from man. So it's not something that he just sees, observes, and picks up from them. And the other one was taught, right? Sorry. It's like a formal teaching.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure they had schools then specifically for religious teachings, and especially with the apostles running about, they were teaching the gospel. And he's saying that he didn't receive the gospel from the apostles' teaching or the teaching of anyone who knew the gospel, nor did he receive it from witnessing people live out the gospel. Actually, probably counter to that, he was persecuting those people. So that revelation was from Jesus Christ himself, and the text is in Acts talking about that and testifying to it.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Okay, that's good. So receive it. These are kind of the two ways that we come to know stuff. It's either taught or caught, right? That's informally. You just kind of catch it. It's in your culture. It's in your traditions. You just kind of receive it in that way. He's saying, that's not how I came by my understanding of the gospel, and it wasn't taught to me in a formal way. Neither one of those things are bad, but he's just saying that's not the way that I received the gospel. I received the gospel because Jesus Christ showed up and revealed himself to me, right? And therefore, that's why we can't change it, right? Anything else before we call it a night, Evan? Nope.
No, I think that's it, yeah.
We're good? Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for joining me here. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and we will see you next week, same place and the same time. God bless.